peculiar kind of madness. I'd always known that my great-grandma was an orphan, but in late October of last year, she decided to tell me the truth about what happened to her family. We were visiting her for her birthday. It was a tradition in our household. A road trip we knew in the back of our minds we'd take only a few more times. She was turning 98, so that was just the cold hard truth of the matter. In my childhood, the journey to central Iowa had been a fun and light-hearted affair. But now my brother and parents could only maintain strained politeness as we met up and hit the road together. Each of us knew that this trip might be our last. For several hours, we drove through vast open farm fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. Advertisements. My great-grandma's house was down a narrow dirt road off a wide dirt road off a gravel tractor lane. As a city boy, it was, more or less, the most remote possible dwelling I could imagine. She was born there, had lived her entire life there, and would soon, well. As we parked in an open muddy rectangle and stepped out to stretch our legs, the constancy of the place surrounded me. Every single year of my life, this house and its land had been exactly the same. The sky was open blue, the earth was a sea of waving gold. And the wind was a smooth river of cool warmth. There was never anything to mar those three pillars of sensory experience except the house, the barn, a defunct old tractor, and the bell. The bell was a simple thing raised high on an old metal crook. It sat out in the fields about a quarter-mile from the house, serving as a measure of the wind. If a storm was coming, the bell was supposed to ring, a necessary precaution in tornado country. The only problem was, the bell and its crook had rusted over long ago. Every time I got out of the family van from age 5 to age 26, I glanced that direction and felt a sense of unease as my gaze fell upon that decayed artifact. This time, at age 27, I looked over and saw that the bell had been scraped and polished clean of rust. It glinted in the sunlight, practically daring me to look at it. I followed my family inside while struggling with a feeling of dread that I couldn't articulate. Who had cleaned the bell? And why? Advertisements. I tried to stop thinking about it as we gathered in the kitchen and said our hellos. My great-grandma was making tea, and shooed off our attempts to help. She was a frail woman for whom movement was difficult, but she'd never let that stop her. The Wi-Fi password is on a note in the living room, she told us with unquestionable authority. Go stare at your phones and the tea will be ready in a moment. My brother and I did as we were told, but my parents turned on the television instead of looking at their phones. For a few minutes, we stayed in our separate worlds, only returning to the present when my great-grandma brought in the tea. And we had a nice time. That night, when everyone else was long asleep, I happened to open my eyes and see a glow under the door of the guest room I shared with my brother. My parents were in a different room and would not see the same light, so it was up to me to investigate. Quietly, so as not to wake him, I crept out and down. Finding my great-grandma still awake. She sat in her big jade leather chair, her gaze on the television. She asked me without looking my way, "You don't fall for this stuff, do you?" "What, like ads?" She pointed her thin little arm at the nearby couch. "Sit." "I Saturday. I'm going to tell you a family secret," she said softly, finally looking my direction. "It's for you, and possibly for your brother, but not your parents. Do you understand?" I didn't, not fully, but I nodded. "You know I was an orphan for a time. Born in this house. Lived with my family, but then raised by an uncle after it happened." She didn't wait for my nod. "I was 10 years old that night. It was my birthday. My mother had gotten me a small cake about the size of your fist. I looked forward to that cake every year. Since we didn't exactly have sweets bounding about back then. It was 11 cents, so rather expensive, but my mother got one for every one of us on our birthdays no matter what she had to scrimp or save. All year long, I saw Mary get her cake in January, Arthur get his cake in March, Eleanor in June, Clarence in July, then Ruth a week after Clarence. Then it was months and months until me, the odd one out, on October 29th. I was so excited for that cake. As the days rolled closer, as the morning dawned, as the hours inched by, I hopped around the house like a bunny rabbit. But I wasn't allowed to eat it until well after supper. I stared at the clock, so I know. Yes, that one on the mantel there, the brass and chrome one. Same one. But I stared at the clock, so I know, night fell at 6:41. That was the moment bright orange stopped glinting off that clock and my mother rose to light a lamp. I looked up at her. Now. She smiled and shook her head. My brothers and sisters complained in a chorus in support of me, but she just shook her head at them. Too soon. And she'll ruin her supper. Father came in from the fields not long after that, dirty and tired as all get out. He ate in silence while we chattered endlessly about what type of cake it would be. Under the frosting, who knew? It might be raspberry, vanilla, or even chocolate. We grew silent as Father neared the cleaning of his plate, an event which would mark the end of supper. 4 pieces of meat and bread remained, then 3, then 2, any moment now. He stopped at the last piece, holding it unmoving above the remaining dollop of gravy. We turned our heads. It was the bell. The bell was ringing out in the fields. Father grunted, then put the last piece of his food back on his plate before rising. He opened the front door, we braced ourselves for the wind, but none came. He spat on and held up a finger to the night air, then shook his head. He moved back into our lamplight and sat. Arthur asked, "Is it gonna storm?" Mary asked, "Is there gonna be a tornado?" My mother shook her head, smiled at us, and told us not to worry. No wind meant no storm. But that bell kept ringing. My father dipped his last piece of food in the gravy and prepared to eat it despite the constantly ringing bell, but then sighed and put it back down. He motioned to Clarence. Clarence was the oldest, so he understood. He was nearly a man himself, and tying the bell would be no problem. He grabbed a candle, protected the flame with his hand, and headed out the open front door. My brothers and sisters and I piled up to the window. Opening it, we found nothing but absolutely still chilly air. We watched his little spot of light move out around the house and into the fields in the direction of the bell. The clanging metallic sound stopped, finally, and the candle's little flame hovered next to it for a solid minute. "Why is he taking so long to tie it?" Ruth asked. Eleanor suggested, "Maybe he's having trouble making a knot. Knots are tough." We watched for another minute or two before, and I know how this sounds, the little flame in the distance began to rise. Slowly, smoothly, straight up. We followed it with our eyes, exclaiming the entire time. As it moved out of sight beyond the roof overhang, the bell began ringing again. "His knot must have come loose," Arthur said. Our parents came to look at our insistence, but there was nothing to see by then. Father motioned to Arthur. "Happy to help out." Arthur grabbed a full lamp rather than a candle. He hurried out the front door, around the house, and into the fields while we watched from the window. The lamp was easier to see, and we were absolutely certain he reached the crook. As the lamplight hovered there, the bell stopped ringing. At that point, we had no reason to think anything was amiss. Maybe the wind had just blown a wisp of burning candle string up into the sky and Clarence had gotten lost in the dark. He would see the lamplight, find Arthur, and they would both come back. The rising little flame we'd seen had just been a fluke. Only problem was, staring out into the autumn night, we still felt no wind at all. We stared at that unmoving light for a strangely long period of time. What was he doing out there? Was he calling for his brother? Why couldn't we hear him, if so? Our parents looked away for a moment, and in that instant, the lamp went out. We children bleated, but by the time they glanced back, there was nothing to see. There was only darkness. The bell began ringing again. My father began grumbling. But there were no more sons to send outside. He narrowed his eyes with thought, then handed Ruth, the oldest girl among us, our main lamp. Our mother laughed. "Ruth, be a dear and go find your silly brothers." Ruth was a little hesitant, but she accepted the lamp. Leaving us in darkness without it, she headed out around the house and into the fields. This lamp was brighter, and we could actually see her carrying hand and her white pajamas in a small lit halo. On the way there, she regularly called out, "Clarence. Arthur, you two lost?" About halfway to where the other two lights had stopped, her calls went instantly silent mid-sentence. "Clarence. Arth." It wasn't that she'd given up yelling. The sound reaching us had simply stopped completely. We could still see her carrying the lamp, still see her hand and pajamas. Still see her turning this way and that. She even raised the house lamp near her face and we saw her shouting into the darkness. We just didn't hear anything, nothing except that constantly clanging bell, growing faster in pace and louder in urgency. "Mary, Eleanor." And I looked up at our parents with fearful gazes. My father shook his head, speaking for the first time that night. "So there's wind out there after all. The air is like a river inside an ocean. It's moving fast out there, carrying her voice away. But we can't feel it here." My mother seemed worried, but she nodded and accepted that. We saw her accepting it, so we gulped and believed it, too. We all glued our eyes to that open window. Ruth reached the bell, and, in that stronger light, it entered our view unmoving at the exact same time we heard it stop ringing. Ruth looked this way and that, clearly concerned. She seemed to silently yell a time or two before moving closer to the motionless bell. A half-tied rope hung from the crook, an indication that someone had attempted to tie it, but we couldn't see Clarence or Arthur anywhere near her. She put the lamp down on the ground to free her hands for tying the rope the rest of the way. But that mostly hid the light among the low-lying recently harvested stalks. We waited, breaths held. The air held in my lungs started to burn. At long last, we were forced to breathe again. Ruth's light continued to sit there, barely visible between the broken plants. "What's taking so long?" Mary asked. Eleanor said, "I hope she's all right. Father told us, she's fine. Damn kids are just playing a game with us." Our mother nodded in agreement. "Eleanor, go fetch your sister, will you?" Eleanor shook her head. "No way. It's scary out there. It's just a game. You're not playing a game with us, too, are you?" "Advertisements." "No," Eleanor gulped. "Then go get your sister and brothers. Tell them to come back in." It was pitch black out there, and almost the same inside with us. Save for one lone candle. Trembling, Eleanor took our last candle and crept out into the night, scooting along the side of the house to stay as close to us as possible. Shakily, she called, "Ruth. Arthur. Clarence. This isn't funny anymore." Now it was we who sat in the dark. As Eleanor began to move further away with the last of our light, we tensed. Father eyed the open front door, and Mother softly moved to close and latch it. I wondered what they meant by that move, because how were the others supposed to get back in? But I supposed they'd unlatch it if anyone came back and knocked. Mother moved away from us in search of more candles. Through it all, the bell kept ringing out in the dark. Increasingly scared, I held Mary's hand tightly and yelled out the window, "Be careful, Ellie." She must have happened to cross that invisible silent threshold at that moment, because she turned around in surprise and stepped closer. "I heard your voice go quiet, but there's no wind. Papa's wrong." She stepped away again. "See, when I pass this point, my..." She held up the candle to show us that her mouth was still moving, but we heard nothing. Come to think of it, her hair wasn't moving, and we hadn't seen Ruth's pajamas billowing in any wind. I asked Father, "What's doing that? What's making it quiet out there?" It's just a game, Father insisted. They're all lying. She's just pretending to make noise so it looks like she's being silenced. Eleanor reached the bell, Father's grip on my shoulder squeezed to nearly painful. She reached down for the lamp Ruth had left. Lifting it with one hand and holding the candle with the other, she approached the clanging bell. "See?" Mary whispered to Father. "The candle's not going out even though she's not protecting the flame. There's no wind out there." "But the bell is ringing," he said gruffly. "So there is wind." Eleanor kept looking left and right as if she'd heard something. Slowly, she reached the bell, which was hanging unmoving from the crook. But we could still hear it ringing. Next to me, Mary began to cry. "It's a game," Father said angrily. "It's just a game they're playing." Eleanor threw the lamp at something in the darkness. We saw the lamp crash, shatter, and go dark, but heard nothing. She raced toward us, candle in hand, but the flame went out because of her haste. We waited to hear her approaching or screaming. But nothing followed. The bell continued to clang. We waited in terrified silence. Mother returned with a candle for each of us, and we sat vigil at the window. Nothing and no one moved. For hours, the bell clanged without wind. The night remained pitch black. The bell clanged. And clanged, driving deeper into our ears with each passing minute. Near midnight, we broke. Father was beyond agitated. "Mary, go find your brothers and sisters." "No," she cried. "I'm not going out there." Mother glared at her. "You have to. This game has to stop." Urged on by both of them, Mary burst into tears and climbed out the window. Holding her small candle, she inched out into the fields. Her sobs went quiet as she passed that same point out in the darkness. Her flame reached the bell, and the ringing stopped. Her flame snuffed out. We held our breaths. The bell began ringing again. Father clenched his fists. "Go." I turned and saw he was looking at me. I suddenly realized I was the only child left in the house, and I felt horribly alone. Everything in me shrieked against the thought of going out into that cursed night. No. My mother wavered in place. No longer adamantly in line with my father, she began to cry, too. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "It's just a game. There's nothing to be scared of. Advertisements." She screamed and demanded, "Why do you keep saying that? Why have I been helping you do this?" He grabbed her and shouted in her face, "Because we haven't been sending our children to their deaths. That's not what's happening." She pushed his hands away and ran for the window. Pushing past me, she tumbled out and ran screaming toward the still clanging bell. Not out of fear of Father, but out of terror for her children. Arthur. Clarence. Ruth. Eleanor. Mary. "For God's sake, where are you?" He growled and leapt out after her, yelling, "We didn't kill them. Everything is fine." They both continued shouting until they passed that point in the dark, and all went silent. Except for the bell. Twice more, it stopped ringing. And twice more, it began again. In panic and terror beyond reason, I closed and latched the window and pushed all of the furniture against every entry to the house. I curled in a cupboard holding the last candle up to my face as it slowly melted its way down toward my fingers. I was alone. Somehow, I was alone. We'd all seen the danger and stared right at it as it happened. But one by one they'd all gone out there anyway. I'd been surrounded by a full band of siblings my entire life, and now I was completely and utterly alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. By the length of my candle, it was 3 a.m. when the knock came at the door. I trembled, but did not make a sound. The knock sounded again 40 heartbeats later. It was louder this time. I shook, holding my candle tight. The third knock was more like a tremendous crash or kick, and I heard the door explode inward. 60 heartbeats of silence passed, and then the floorboards creaked. Something in me told me to put out my candle for fear of it being seen through the cracks in the cupboard, but I didn't dare. Not darkness. I couldn't handle darkness. I would scream if I did, so I kept it lit. Slow, quiet steps moved through the house. Whoever it was seemed to be pausing and listening at times. At others, they would rush forward to a random spot in a sudden frenzy and then stop abruptly. 400 heartbeats after that, the bell began ringing again. But this time, it rang from inside the house. It rang from the kitchen. It rang from near the bed. It rang outside my cupboard. Clang, 10 feet away, clang, 5 feet away, clang, right up against the cupboard door. And then it opened. I sat expectantly, mouth open and eyes wide, as I waited for my great-grandmother to continue. After a bit, I realized that was it. But what did you see? She shook her head. That's not the point. I'm here, so obviously I survived, and a young man like you doesn't need to know what horrors walk this world outside the paved cities of man. Gulping, I asked, you're not just pulling my leg. This really happened? Yes. Her gaze went distant by television light. But here's what I want to tell you, and what you should tell your brother. The thing that opened that cupboard door and stared at me from the dark, the thing that hoped to wait out my candle before the coming of dawn, had a bell tied to one of its teeth with a blood-soaked rag, such that it would clang when its mouth was open for hunting. Somehow, some way, some heroic poor soul managed to tie a warning bell to that thing before they died. We heard that warning bell all night long, and yet my entire family walked out there one by one. We didn't listen because we didn't want to listen. My father knew what he was doing halfway through, but he didn't want to accept what he'd already done, so he did even worse to continue living the lie. I narrowed my eyes. What are you saying? She grabbed my hand briefly. Fear will tell you to put your candle out, but your head will tell you to keep it lit. Don't give in to fear. You keep it lit, you'll get through this. Turning my head, I became aware of a sound in the distance. Is that the bell? I was so caught up I didn't notice. How long has that been ringing? She just clenched her fist and turned back to the television. Decay. Can you feel this? I asked as I checked all his limbs. Not a thing. He responded. But, it hurts so much on the inside. Where exactly does it hurt? I asked. Everywhere, please do something. He begged. I gave Brian a dose of fentanyl. But without a heartbeat to move the drug around, I had little hope it would take any effect at all. To keep him distracted from the pain, I asked mundane things about life, what his hobbies were, family stuff. He was smart enough to realize my intentions, but went along with it. Either out of fear, or because he actually hoped someone could save him. Hours passed while we waited for someone to tell us what to do. Half the surgical staff had been put into quarantine, terrified that they might be infected. Finally the CDC arrived on scene, fully geared in hazmat suits. They allowed us to roll Brian into his own space. A pre-operation room had been evacuated, so he could stay somewhat comfortable. The rest of us would be put into the surgical office while the situation was being assessed. I decided to stay with Brian. No one should have to suffer alone. Especially with the CDC agents probing him with all sorts of needles, enthusiastically taking samples. The only reason they allowed me to stay, was because I kept him relatively calm. Advertisements. We talked through the night. After the procedures were finished I couldn't sleep. And I doubt Brian was physically capable of it. My eyes feel a bit weird. He said. Do they hurt? No, the edges are just kind of blurry, it's weird. I left to talk to George, who was still working around the clock, calling around. Making sure the other patients were redirected elsewhere. What if we put the kid on a heart-lung machine? I asked. George put the phone down for a moment and sighed. Then what? He has no functioning liver, his aorta is cut into pieces and his intestines shredded. Even if we got him a new heart, he'd never survive. George responded. Just keep him company while you can. I knew he was right, but some of my professional knowledge was put aside due to the insane nature of the situation. "Doctor!" Brian shouted. I rushed to his side. I can't see." He stuttered. I pulled out a flashlight and examined his eyes. Both pupils were unresponsive, and his eyes had started to almost deflate, which was one of the stages of decomposition. Brian had started to rot. "Please, I'm so scared." Brian was a brave kid. But he started to lose his composure just like everyone else in the ward. I kept talking to him, but the inevitable truth was that if he kept decomposing, he'd soon lose all his senses, all the while being conscious to experience it. As horrible as it might sound, I begged that it might finally allow him to pass on. We kept talking. I asked him if there's anyone he wanted to call, but as I already knew from the others, Brian's mother had died during childbirth, and his father had been in the same accident as himself. As we talked, Brian's voice kept getting louder, as if he was struggling to hear. "Are you hearing me all right?" I asked. "What did you say?" Brian basically yelled. His hearing had deteriorated within minutes, going from impaired to deafness, before I could even begin to help. With him being blind and deaf, we no longer had a way of communicating. No matter my attempts, I couldn't comfort the dying kid, and the CDC quickly decided that my presence had become unnecessary. Brian kept screaming in terror and agony after I left. For each passing second his own body started digesting itself, and nothing we could do would take the pain away. By the morning, his screams had silenced. I barged into the room, much to the dismay of the agents. Brian was hooked up to hundreds of cables, monitoring his heart, brain, muscles and vital values. Advertisements. Of course, his heart showed no activity, and the decay had progressed to shut down all his muscles. He had quieted down not because the pain was gone, but because he wasn't able to scream anymore. The only part of his body still working was his brain. What the hell happened? I asked. "Get him out of here," one of the men demanded. The other man complied, but went outside with me to explain the situation. "You don't have to worry about it being contagious, we'll lift the quarantine in a moment," he said. He looked weirdly somber as he spoke those words. "What about Brian, what will happen to him? He's still conscious, but he has no respiratory function anymore. So we have no means of communicating." Brain was still alive. Blind, deaf and dumb, he had to suffer in loneliness. Unable to die. "How long does he have to suffer?" I asked. "We'll know more when we move him to our specialized facility." The senior CDC agent demanded that his colleague kept quiet before they could tell me anything else. They left with Brian, covered him in an airtight capsule, so no one would see the horrors that had just occurred within our surgical ward. As soon as the quarantine was lifted, I headed home to write up my letter of resignation. I had a well-connected contact within the CDC, but upon trying to get more information, he claimed no such case had even been presented to them, that no one had ever been admitted to their facility under the name of Brian Dawson. About a month later, a lawyer, accompanied by a doctor, showed up at my door with a bunch of documents, all regarding doctor-patient confidentiality. The lawyer looked tired, worked down to the bone, as if he'd made many such trips before. He asked me to sign the documents and to never speak of this again, saying I'd lose my medical license if I did. Not that it mattered to me, I'm done in that field for good. I was given an injection by the doctor. He told me that Brian's disease was not unfamiliar to them, and that it was extremely contagious, but only upon death. He explained that half the population is infected with a disease that keeps the brain conscious for hours, even days following death. Brian's case was special in the sense that he actually retained some motor function, and was able to speak to us. The injection given was not a cure, it'll only prevent me from spreading the disease, but once I die, I'll suffer a fate similar to Brian's. I just hope someone will stay with me when it happens. Am I going to die? The kid asked me as he was being rolled into the operating theater. It was a question I'd heard 1,000 times before, but answering it truthfully hadn't become any easier, even after years at the hospital. Of course not, we're gonna fix you right up. I lied. He'd been crushed in a horrific car accident, and though we would put all our effort into saving his life, hope was a limited resource. The fact that he even remained conscious despite losing most of his blood was bizarre enough, but after 10 years on the job nothing surprised me anymore. The anesthesiologist quickly put him under while we scrubbed in for surgery. Damien would be the surgeon, a specialist in polytrauma cases, and I'd assist. No sooner had we opened him up before we shared a look of disappointment. There was no chance in hell he'd survive through surgery. Despite our lack of faith, we tried our best, but after only half an hour on the table, his heart gave out. How was he still alive when he arrived? Damien asked. He pronounced the time of death and left us to clean up the mess. I took the responsibility of cleaning the kid up for the morgue, a task I'd committed to countless times before. It wasn't something I personally enjoyed, but to me it was my final chance to pay respect to the dead. The kid couldn't have been more than 15. And as I'd hear, he was just learning to drive. Unexperienced, and attempting his first drive on a slippery road, he managed to steer off into a ditch. His father died on impact, but he himself lived long enough to face surgery. As I put the needle to his open abdomen, his body twitched for a moment. I retracted the needle in surprise, wondering what had caused a post-mortem spasm. Then the boy suddenly gasped for air as his eyes shut open. He let out the most violent scream imaginable as he suddenly returned to life. "Help me," he begged with a guttural voice as I stumbled back in panic and slipped onto the floor. I called for help and the rest of the team came running into the operating theater, each panicking as they witnessed the dead boy scream on the operating table. His spine was fractures. So though he yelled in agony, he could do nothing to move. The anesthesiologist quickly attempted to sedate him while we checked his vitals. Despite all evidence pointing to the contrary, his heart had not started beating again. He was supposed to be dead. I started chest compressions, desperately trying to get his heart going. I cringed to the sound of his ribs cracking beneath my hands, and the boy's screams turned to gargles as he was unable to gasp for another breath. "He's not going under," the anesthesiologist yelled as he gave the kid a second dose of propofol. Of course, without a functioning heart, there'd be no way for the drug to flow through his veins, even as I tried my best to pump for him. After an hour of compressions, the chief of surgery had intervened, and ordered us to stop. At that point we caused more damage than we helped. What's happening to me?" The kid stuttered, still conscious. None of us responded, we couldn't find any words to describe the horrific sight before us. Most of the staff had left due to the sight. We'd faced many challenges in our career, but nothing quite like this. "What's your name?" I asked, despite already having seen it in the file. I just wanted him to focus. "Brian Dawson," he responded. I took a deep breath, doing my best to keep my composure. "You were in an accident, Brian," I told him. His eyes darted frantically around the room as he started to realize where he was. He tried to lift his neck, but due to the spinal fracture he was completely paralyzed. "Advertisement. I can't move, I can't move," he cried. I walked closer, standing directly above him. "Brian, your heart isn't beating," I said. The chief of surgery, George, grabbed me by my shoulder and whispered into my ear. "We need to isolate the ore. Whatever is happening here is beyond us, and it could be contagious," George said. He rushed into the preparation room, picked up the phone. Through the glass door I couldn't hear what he said, but I assumed he was calling security to shut down the ward. What about my father? Brian asked, trying to hold back tears. I was taken aback by his question. I just told him his heart was destroyed, and that was essentially dead. Yet his first concern was regarding his father. I'm sorry, Brian, he died on impact. He sobbed quietly. So, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to die, aren't I? He asked. I didn't know what to say. I'd never been in any similar situation. So I just gave the only answer I thought might be of some comfort. You're not alone, I'm staying here until the end. George had been quick to shut down the operating theater, and the Center for Disease Control had long since been alerted to our situation. We had nothing to do but to wait. And pray to any god that Brian wasn't contagious. I had already been exposed, so I examined Brian, checking for any chance of improving his situation.